The knock at 1:24 a.m. Boston was sleeping when the doorbell rang. It was the kind of bitter March night that keeps a city indoors. Wind off the harbor, a mist that wasn't quite rain and wasn't quite fog, and streets so quiet you could hear the echo of your own shoes. Inside the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the galleries sat in perfect stillness. Gilded frames glowed faintly in the emergency lights. Parquet floors held the day's last footprints, and motion sensors blinked their patient red heartbeat. In the control room, two night guards rode out the shift the way 100 guards had done before them. Coffee cooling in paper cups, the whir of CRT monitors, a stack of paperwork with more empty spaces than notes. It was St. Patrick's Day weekend. Nothing ever happened. Then the intercom crackled. A male voice. Boston Police. "We got a report. You need to let us in." One guard exchanged a look with the other. It was late past 1 in the morning, and procedure said, "Don't open the door." But the uniforms and the fisheye lens looked right enough. Dark jackets, badges catching the light, the posture of people who expected to be obeyed. The voice added a pressure that lives in the bones of every city worker. "It'll be faster if you just buzz us in." The guard hesitated, then leaned forward, pressed the button, and unlocked the door. The officers came in with the weather. They shook off the damp boots, scraping the mat, and asked the guard to step out from behind the desk. "Routine questions," they said. "Face the wall, please. Hands where we can see them." The second guard arrived just in time to hear the words that turned routine into nightmare. "This is a robbery." Zip ties bit into wrists. Duct tape whispered, then sealed. The guards were led down into the basement and sat on the concrete ankles, bound eyes covered. The men who had walked in wearing police gear moved with a confidence that said this wasn't their first time rehearsing the route. A radio squawked softly. One of them checked his watch. They had time more than an hour if they kept their nerve. Above them, the museum became a maze they knew how to solve. The thieves didn't bother with the cameras they couldn't reach. They simply walked where the angles were blind. They moved past vases and furniture and smaller portable things that would have tempted amateurs. They weren't amateurs. They headed for the rooms that mattered, the Dutch room, with its Rembrandts, the Vermeer, that anchored a whole wall, the Degas works, that lined a corridor like breadcrumbs through a century. They carried blades and cutter's tools for speed rather than elegance. The edges would be rough, the canvases scarred, but the frames could be dealt with later. What mattered was the work. What mattered was time. Back in the control room, a red light blinked where a door hadn't fully latched. A chime sounded and then stopped. The tape machine recorded everything and nothing at once: movement, without faces, motion, without names. The guards would later try to replay the sequence in their heads, the intercom tone, the first glimpse of the badges, the moment they chose to cooperate. Memory under duress is a hall of mirrors. The more you walk it, the less sure you are of the exits. In the Dutch room, the thieves paused before the storm at sea that had hung there for decades, a ship lashed by waves that were painted so deeply you could almost hear them. The canvas came free with a sound like fabric tearing from history. They left the frame behind empty and ornate, a wound on the wall. Nearby, another frame joined it. In the corridor, drawings were slipped from their mats like letters from envelopes. Somewhere, a foot scuffed the floor. Somewhere else, a sensor blinked meaningless warnings that no one was left to see. Every few minutes, one of the thieves checked his watch. They were still inside the window. Downstairs, The guards sat in the kind of silence that empties the lungs. Fear stretches time. A minute becomes 5, 5 becomes 20. They tried to slow their breathing, to listen for footsteps above, to make sense of the direction of the sounds. At one point, a door boomed somewhere in the building, and one of the guards flinched so hard the tape tugged at his skin. In the absence of sight, the mind fills in pictures. None of them were good. The thieves worked the way professionals in any field work, dividing tasks without speaking, compensating for small surprises without changing the plan. The building itself helped them a century-old mansion refit into a museum with quirks in its bones and sightlines that left islands of shadow. If you knew where to stand, you could become a ghost. They knew. Outside, a cruiser coasted past on a routine loop, its windows fogged from the heater, its driver humming unaware. In the surrounding streets, apartment lights flickered off one by one. Somewhere, a cab slowed, then sped on. Whatever the city was dreaming that night, it was not this. When the thieves finally retraced their steps, they left a path of absences. Frames that now held only air, hooks bare against plaster, security cords dangling uselessly as if the building had been unplugged. The weight of what they carried didn't show. Rolled canvases and bundled works ride quiet if you know how to move them. They took one last look around a habit, not a need, and then headed for the door they had come through the museum, breathing behind them, like a great animal returning to sleep. In the basement, the guards counted heartbeats. They tried to memorize the sequence of sounds, footsteps overhead. A thud, then a stretch of nothing, then the soft metallic complaint of the front door. And then, after a pause that felt like a cliff edge, the building settled. The air changed the way rooms do when the people inside them leave. At 2:45 a.m., the night resumed the shape it had before 1:24. The monitors kept recording. The lights kept their quiet pulse. Somewhere a boiler kicked on. The city turned on its pillow and slept through the last hours before morning. It wasn't until the day shift arrived, key in the lock, a frown at the empty desk, that the stillness broke. A call went unanswered. Another key turned, another door opened, and then the discovery in the basement led to the first shouted words of the day. The tape came off, the ties were cut, and two faces, pale and blinking, told a story that would quickly outgrow them. The police arrived for real this time in numbers and sirens and notebooks. The museum's director was called from her bed. The sun lifted its face over the city and found a gallery with holes where masterpieces used to be. By late morning, the steps were crowded with cameras and cables. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Why open the door? How did they know where to go? Why those works and not others? The guards repeated what they could, then sat silent when the facts ran out. Behind them, investigators photographed the wounds, the frames that now served as memorials, the rough edges where canvases had been cut, the path the thieves had taken through the building like a signature written in absence. The story would grow from here, branching into theories and tips, rewards and regrets. It would become a legend, the kind a city carries like a scar it shows off and hides at the same time. But inside that first hour and 21 minutes, 81 minutes start to finish, everything essential had already been decided. The door had opened. The uniforms had been enough. The route had been practiced. And a museum that believed it had seen a century's worth of trouble learned before dawn, on a Sunday, how quickly the past can be stolen. For years afterward, visitors would stand in the Dutch room and stare not at paintings, but at frames, the emptiness inside them louder than any crowd. They would lower their voices without meaning to, as if the missing could hear. Guides would gesture palms open to spaces that once held a Vermeer, a Rembrandt works, whose names became shorthand for questions without answers. And in every retelling of that night, the moment at the door remained the hinge, a ring, a voice, a choice. The rest of the story, the hunt, the suspects, the ransom, whispers, the theories that spiraled out from the basement to the docks and far beyond, would come later. But to understand why the frames are still empty, you have to start where the thieves did, with a bell, a lie, and a door that should have stayed closed. 81 minutes inside. They would later call it 81 minutes, but inside the building time didn't move that cleanly. It stretched and contracted with each decision, each hallway, each choice of door. What read on a watch as 1:32 or 1:57 felt within the galleries like a tide surging when a frame yielded slowing, when a stubborn screw refused to turn. Museums are built for lingering. Thieves are not. And yet, as they crossed the threshold from the service corridor into the heart of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the two men moved with the patience of people who had practiced, if not here then, somewhere close enough to count. They began where the night guards could not see them, the long angle that left the Dutch room in a kind of camera shadow. Even in emergency lighting, the room looked theatrical, heavy gilded frames, catching a thin stitch of illumination, dark paneling swallowing the rest. No chatter, no adrenaline laughter, none of the noise amateurs make when they're surprised to be getting away with something. One thief unpacked the tools, the other scanned the walls as if ticking off a list he kept in his head. There are different ways to steal a painting, lift it with its frame and risk bulk and alarms, or cut it and take only the story. They chose the second kind. Metal-kissed canvas. The first incision sounded like a new seam in old cloth. A centuries-long brushstroke let go. After that, the room began to empty without losing a single ounce of weight. In theft, absence can be louder than presence. A seascape that had roared without sound now roared in its absence. A pair of Dutch figures, black silk and lace once pinned inside their rectangle, became a ghost couple defined by a Baroque void. On another wall, a small self-portrait in print-etched lines mapping a young face was handled with the delicacy of someone who knew what could be rolled, what had to be carried flat, what could be slipped into a folder with a cardboard backer and ride out beneath a jacket. Frames remained like ribs without lungs. They didn't come for the most expensive thing in the building by any auctioneer's metric. They came for what they could take quickly and carry confidently. That's the part that would nag at investigators for years. The mix. A masterwork here, a drawing there, a bronze vessel, from a case, an ancient beaker lifted with the same economy of movement used on a modern street sign. It looked at first like a contradiction. Later, it would read like a signature. The soundscape of the heist was small and specific, a blade working through canvas, the rasp of fabric against gilt, a frame set gently against the floor, the dry squeak of museum rope that had been cut free and now swung without purpose. Somewhere, a motion sensor recorded their passage as numbers on a tape. That record would later be translated into a path entrance here, turn there, climb this stair, cross that gallery, lingered double back. In a crime with no faces, the route would become the most reliable witness. They moved out of the Dutch room and into a second-floor hallway where drawings hung in trim mat boards, like breaths, along a corridor. Here, A gloved hand did delicate work, backing clips, eased glass-lifted paper, slid free, and tucked into a carrier. Small doesn't mean simple. Small means you can walk faster on the way out. The museum, even while being robbed, cooperated with its keepers. The drawers that opened the frames that designed to be serviced yielded to a practiced hand. Every gesture said, "We've done this before. If not here, then in another room, with another guard asleep, a floor below." Down in the basement, sleep was not the word either guard would ever use. They counted steps above, then counted seconds between them, then counted the beats of their own pulse, then stopped counting because numbers put them inside a clock that wouldn't move. Simple thoughts rose like markers in dark water. I broke the rule at the door. I looked at the badge, not the face. I can't see. I don't know how long it's been. The tape along the cheek itched beneath winter-dry skin. A boot nudged gravel somewhere in a service hall. A radio chirped a tiny domestic sound and then went quiet again. Upstairs, the thieves tried one thing that didn't work, a framed painting that wouldn't release without a fight, and moved on without wasting time. The choice felt almost courteous in its restraint. If it takes too long, leave it. The inventory of what they did take grew in the negative spaces, where there had been substance outlines, where there had been images. A gilded finial, bright imperial, disappeared into a bag, its absence leaving a jagged little geometry on a pole where ceremony used to live. A small French painting, intimate enough to be slipped into a briefcase, traded the hush of a cafe for the hush of a getaway car. They did not go everywhere. They did not need to. A third floor full of other treasures went unvisited because time, not taste, was the rule of the night. Outside, the city kept its bargain with sleeping. Fog pressed its back against brick. A stoplight cycled through its colors for no one. In one apartment window, a television cast a blue square onto a ceiling. A taxi took a corner too fast and then slowed the driver, remembering his own advice to himself about being careful this late. On the museum's perimeter, a camera recorded an empty street because an empty street was all it had to record. What the building knew and what the outside world could see were two different truths, both accurate, neither complete. At some point, maybe 50 minutes and something like relief threaded the thieves' movements. Not celebration, there's no victory lap inside a clock, but the relaxation of shoulders that know they're still ahead of the hour. They retraced steps, not to correct a mistake, but to tighten a loop. A last check for tools. A last glance at a wall to confirm that nothing hung that shouldn't. They secured the bundles, the way film grips secure a cable wrap, twist-tuck lift. The weight of stolen art is not just physical. It changes the air around it. It makes ordinary doors feel narrower. It makes stair landings feel shorter. It makes every sound behind you sound like a footfall that will put a hand on your shoulder. There is a moment any professional will tell you when an operation resolves into a single action. In this one, it was the door. The same door that had opened on a voice now opened on silence. Cold crept in at the ankles. Streetlight thin as a knife's edge split the lobby. The thieves paused, not from doubt, but from discipline, listening for the thing you only hear when you're listening for it nothing. Then the first step over the threshold. Then the second, and then the building behind them exhaled. On the wall of the Dutch room, the gilt radiated around emptiness, like a halo in reverse. In the corridor, the places where drawings had been became bright rectangles, paler than the rest of the wall, as if the building had kept a tan under everything it wore. The museum was not ruined, it was wounded. Wounds can be cleaned, sutured, dressed. Some never truly heal. The frames were not taken down in the aftermath. They would remain as the museum's own memorial, negative space, turned into an exhibit about negative space. Visitors in later years would plant their feet, fold their arms, and look at nothing, feel it, even until the guard in the room coughed politely and they moved along. When the day shift cut the tape and hauled the night back into the world of names and forms, the first hours of the investigation were a rehearsal for the weeks that would follow, urgent questions with slow answers. Who opened the door? Why? What did you see? Hear, smell? Did the uniforms look right? How tall? How many? Which way did they go when they left? The guards pale from basement air, and the pressure of silence said what they could. A watch face, a height, the cadence of a voice that knew how to measure authority. They did not have what reporters and detectives wanted most, a face you could draw. By noon, the staircase was braided with cables, microphones like gray fruit blooming on poles, cameras planted where museum staff had stood that morning to stare. Inside, evidence flags sprouted in the Dutch room, like field markers on a crime scene diagram. Technicians shot the frames as if they were portraits. Now their gold leaf, their burrs of canvas, left where the blade had hurried their placards that still spoke politely about works that were in the room and not in the room at the same time. A conservator bent to inspect a sliver of fiber on the floor. An officer noted the angle of a cut with the interest of someone who had never considered that canvas had grain. The story that went to print that evening contained more holes than facts. That's how first-day stories work. Two men dressed as police. A buzzer answered. Ties. Tape. 81 minutes. 13 works. A number with a dollar sign that would grow in retellings until it no longer had any relationship to paint, paper, bronze, or time. Reporters tried to say Rembrandt and Vermeer without making it sound like a list of saints. The museum spokesperson tried to say, "We will recover them," without making it sound like a prayer. Behind the microphones, someone in a suit took a call and stepped away, already hearing in a far-off voice the first rumor, the first tip, the first confidently delivered false lead. A city like Boston breeds theories the way a cold sky breeds weather. Some come in off the harbor. Some rise from the pavement. All of them look like truth for a minute if you want them to badly enough. The detectives went home late that night, knowing two things. Whoever had walked into the building had planned more than they had improvised, and whoever had planned it had done so with information no tourist could have gleaned. Whether that information came from a blueprint, a conversation, or a previous walkthrough was the next question. The kind of question that makes phones ring at odd hours and pulls old names out of old notebooks. 81 minutes wasn't the length of the crime, the senior investigator would say later. It was the length of the prologue. What followed would stretch years. Tips would arrive from docks and diners and faraway storage lockers. Faces would be sketched and then erased. Theories would bloom, cross-pollinate, and die back. Rewards would be posted in amounts that made bank managers blink. And inside the museum, visitors would keep coming, filing past the frames that had become an exhibit called loss. The thieves had taken pictures from the walls. The story they left behind was the one the city could not stop looking at. The morning after, morning did not so much arrive as intrude. It pushed through the glass roof of the courtyard, washed the marble with a gray that made night's secrets look suddenly procedural, and found two guards blinking in fluorescent light wrists, rubbed raw where the ties had been. The museum's day crew gathered in the lobby, half awake, half afraid to step forward, as the first uniforms took statements in low voices, and the second wave moved like metronomes through the galleries counting what wasn't there. The phones began their day with panic. One went to the director, who was already halfway into a coat when the caller finished the sentence that didn't seem to belong to this building. The frames are empty. Another rang a detective who had learned long ago that the jobs you remember always start with a detail that shouldn't be possible. Still, another reached the museum's publicist, who stared at a blinking cursor, trying to find words that would keep a calamity from sounding like a myth in the making. The basement became an annex of triage. Medics checked pupils, took pulses, wrote the same observation twice because their hands were cold, stable, shaken. The guards' statements arrived in fragments not because they were evasive, but because memory under stress is a shoreline with a changing tide. The badges looked right. The tone sounded right. The first instructions felt like routine, then tape, then ties, then a walk into a room that was not for visitors. Smells damp wool, duct tape coffee going stale somewhere upstairs. Sounds radios, a shoe-scraping concrete footsteps overhead that arranged themselves into patterns you could follow with your ears until they stopped. Upstairs, the first photographs of the morning were not of art, but of absences. A technician crouched to shoot the raw edge, where canvas had been separated from its frame, a tiny serration that said speed won out over finesse. Another took wide shots that would become the images every article would run gold against plaster nothing where something had always been. A conservator ran a palm inches above a frame, as if feeling heat would tell her anything about the night. She explained to the officer with the notebook that the choice to cut is not just about time. It's about control. It means you're certain you can move the work in a smaller package. It means you've practiced. Within an hour, the building's routines had been replaced with choreography. Blue tape marked lanes for people who were allowed to pass and people who were not. Evidence flags sprouted like winter weeds. The control room became a chapel for monitors no one trusted, but everyone needed. A detective rewound tape with a pencil eraser, watched lines of static and numbers, then rewound again, because sometimes seeing it twice is the difference between superstition and fact. A door alarm had chimed and gone quiet. A motion zone had flared, then calmed. None of it showed faces. All of it proved that 81 minutes can be both very long and not long at all. By 9 o'clock, the steps outside had turned into a press pen. Tripods marched in formation. Boom mics dipped and rose like fishing rods over a restless tide. The first questions were the ones that never get good answers. How much is it worth? Who would do such a thing? Why those works? The numbers escalated in real time, each outlet choosing a figure, like choosing a headline font. A spokesman tried sentences built to sound measured. We are cooperating fully. We are working with federal authorities. Our focus is recovery. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that a museum is a memory palace, and today the palace woke up with a hole in its head. The city did what cities do, with sudden stories. It improvised a chorus. A neighbor swore he had heard sirens that never came. A taxi driver was sure he had seen a van with its lights off at 3 at the corner near the river. Someone at a diner said the uniforms on the thieves were wrong, and someone else said the uniforms were exactly right. And both statements made the detectives write down the same word in their notebooks inside. Inside is a theory with 1,000 doors. It can mean a floor plan, a conversation in a bar, a guard who talked when he shouldn't have a contractor with a good memory, a sketch passed along at a party where someone wanted to impress someone else. The lead detective didn't say any of that out loud. He just asked for the last month's maintenance logs, a copy of the guard schedule, and a list of every person who had had a badge in the past year. He asked for the opening procedure, the closing procedure, and the thing in between, that every institution invents for itself what really happens when no one is watching on the nights when nothing happens. The guards told their story twice before lunch and will tell it 100 times more before they're done the ring. At 1:24, the voice on the intercom, the look at the screen, the choice at the door. The decision to unlock is never just one person's decision. It is the end of a line of habit design expectation and fatigue. The detective didn't say that either. He just asked them to try one more time to describe the way the taller one held himself and how the shorter one spoke to them, because cadence is a fingerprint and posture is a signature, and sometimes a jury believes what a camera never saw. By midday, help had sprouted federal seals. Agents walked the perimeter, ran plates off nearby curb lines, pulled municipal camera footage from intersections that were never supposed to matter and suddenly did. Someone floated the word reward, and a number followed it, and the phone bank that had been quiet all morning started to sound like the backstage of a telethon. Tips have shapes. Some are rectangles, names and addresses. Some are weather impressions and weathers and rumors blown in from other storms. All of them have to be written down. All of them have to be sorted. The first trick is to believe just enough. The second is to stop believing at the right second. In the galleries, staff walked a slow procession that felt half liturgical, half forensic. They stopped at each frame, read the plaque aloud, as if the act might call the work back, and then moved on. A guide rehearsed under her breath what she would say when the building reopened. She tried a sentence that replaced was with is and decided that even grammar had grief. A security supervisor stood under the camera that had missed the angle and ran a thumb along the baseboard, feeling for the invisible line where a good enough sight line had become the kind of generosity thieves count on. The director convened a meeting in an office that still smelled like cold air from the courtyard board chair council, head of security, head of collections, a speakerphone that added people whose faces would be remembered for months as names, and then after the first anniversary no longer. Decisions the museum would close for now. The frames would stay up. A public statement would be honest about what could be said and silent about what could not. The hardest part was agreeing on how to talk about loss without making absence feel permanent. In the end, the building would do the talking for them. Visitors would stand in front of emptiness and feel it. By late afternoon, the first sketches were pinned to a corkboard, two figures built from adjectives, tall or shorter, the tone of someone used to giving instructions, the rhythm of someone used to being obeyed. The sketches were not faces so much as probabilities, and the detective knew the risk of probabilities printed on the evening news. He signed off anyway. At the bottom of the storyboard, someone had written reward offered. The zeros looked like eyes. The day moved in increments. Another statement, another bag sealed, and initialed another call from a reporter who used a word the director hated: iconic, priceless masterpiece, any synonym for what cannot be replaced. The team in the control room scrolled and rewound and scrolled again, stopping on empty hallways as if the emptiness might eventually confess. The basement was quiet. The guards had been sent home with instructions not to talk to anyone, which was both a legal necessity and a human impossibility. The museum's voicemail filled with voices that sounded like apologies and offers and superstition. I saw a van. My cousin knows a guy. I once heard that stolen art goes to a yacht. My uncle swears he can fence anything. A friend of a friend has a warehouse. When the sun collapsed behind the skyline and the building exhaled the day's last visitors, technicians, detectives, administrators with armfuls of folders, the museum looked from the street almost normal. Warm squares of light held their ground in a blue evening. The courtyard palms kept their own quiet. The Dutch room, if you hadn't seen it that morning, was still a room you could describe as elegant. It was only when you stepped inside and let your eyes slide to the places where paintings used to hang that the day rewrote itself around you. The lead detective walked the path one last time, not because he expected to find something he had missed, but because walking is how you think when your head is crowded with notes. He paused in the doorway, pictured the night from the thieves' point of view, then pictured it from the guard's point of view, then from the camera's point of view that had no point of view at all. He wrote one word on a blank page and closed the notebook leverage. Not value, not beauty, leverage, because stolen art is rarely a trophy. It is a tool, a bargaining chip in crimes that aren't about art at all. He stepped out into evening and let the door latch behind him. The frames would wait. The phones would keep ringing. The reward would grow. The tip line would learn the difference between certainty and performance. And the case would open like a map that refused to fold the same way twice. Tomorrow would bring the first theory that stuck long enough to become a story. It would also bring 5 more that sounded better and were worse. Before any of that, the museum would do what wounded things do. It would hold still. It would let the night come back lighter this time, because now the city was watching. The first theories. By the second morning, the case had already started to split into stories. That's what big crimes do. They give the city a mirror, and every person who looks into it sees a different culprit staring back. In the bullpen at headquarters, maps went up and strings were pinned. Phone logs multiplied into binders, and a whiteboard took on the look of a crossword no one could finish. On TV anchors stood in front of the museum's limestone and called it brazen, a word that buys time, while producers learn how to pronounce the painters' names. Inside the building, the frames stayed where they were gilt halos around nothing, because the museum decided the truth, however ugly, should be visible. The first theory was the oldest one in the book, inside knowledge. Not a traitor necessarily, just someone who understood the building better than a tourist could. A contractor who'd worked the wiring and kept a mental map. A temp who had listened too closely to a closing checklist. A friend of a friend in a bar who'd asked one too many innocent questions. The lead detective drew a circle that began with staff and widened through former employees, vendors, night crews, anyone who knew which hallway a camera didn't quite cover. He wasn't accusing, he was sorting. There's a difference the public rarely hears. The next theory came wearing a uniform of its own organized crime. The thieves' calm, their route, the choice to cut canvases instead of wrestling frames, none of it smelled like impulse. Art doesn't move like cash, but it does move. And sometimes it moves sideways, a marker in a debt collateral. For a shipment, a bargaining chip tucked away until its value lies not in beauty, but in leverage. The detectives didn't have to say the words out loud. The city said them for them. In diners and at docks, names were weighed like coins on a palm. Everyone knew someone who knew a story about a warehouse. Rewards have gravity. The museum's number went public, and with it, the phones began to ring in a different key. Tips came in clusters shaped like weather-sudden squalls of certainty, then long stretches of gray. From across town, from across the country, from countries where an empty frame in Boston would seem like a rumor. Some callers brought details that felt almost right until you tried to touch them. Others brought the wrong painting to the right room. A few brought the kind of specific that makes a room go quiet. Measurements, a turn of phrase about a cut edge, the location of a stair you'd only know by walking it in the dark. Each of those got a line straight to the top of the pile. Most did not. On day 3, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a letter that talked like a ransom note but never said the word. It dangled proof without offering. It asked for assurances no court could give and used the kind of phrasing people adopt when they want to sound like someone who knows something. The museum's counsel read it twice, and then a third time, searching for a thread that could be pulled without unraveling the law. The director looked past the words to the frames upstairs and asked the only question that mattered: is there a path from this paper to that wall? The detectives shrugged in a way that meant maybe, but probably not today. Back in the galleries, conservators made a different kind of case file, one that had to do with edges and fibers and the way paint behaves when it has been rolled too tightly by someone who doesn't want to crease a century. They photographed the wounds as if the images might function one day like dental records. They talked softly about humidity and the life expectancy of a canvas that has been turned into a cylinder, and those conversations made their way into the detectives' notebooks, because in an investigation like this, science becomes a kind of rumor with footnotes. The public wanted villains, and the press wanted faces, but the case fed mostly topography. The route logged by motion sensors, the exact minutes they lingered in the Dutch room, the choice not to climb to a third floor full of things a different crew might have tried to take. Why these not those investigators began to speak carefully about appetite and logistics. Some objects telegraph difficulty at a glance, weight glass alarms built into frames that don't like to be hurried. Others offer themselves to speed. You can learn a lot about a thief from the kind of silence he leaves behind. When the detective in charge briefed the museum's board, he didn't use the number with a dollar sign that was now headlining every broadcast. He talked about time. He drew the museum's footprint and marked the blind angles. The interior turns the staircase that could be climbed without crossing a particular sensor. He said the word practiced with the weary care of a man who knows what it sounds like when a city hears it. Practice doesn't mean rehearsed here, he said. It means they've done this work somewhere. The difference mattered. It didn't make anyone feel better. Another letter arrived, then a phone call. Then a person at a distance who claimed to be a broker for someone who knew someone and who asked politely, with the bureaucratic diction of a customer service rep, for assurances that possession would not equal prosecution. Lawyers know these dances. They have names for every step. The museum and the police and the federal agents assigned to the case performed the choreography with the same caution the thieves had used in the galleries. A misstep too early, and the conversation ends. A misstep too late, and you've shaken hands with a ghost. Meanwhile, the city built a mythology. Taxi drivers told one another that the canvases were already at sea in a crate marked as something boring. A bartender swore a regular had paid a tab with stories about a storage unit by the highway where the air smelled like varnish. Someone said the thieves were amateurs because who cuts a Rembrandt? Someone else said the thieves were professionals because who leaves behind a painting downstairs that would have slowed them by 20 minutes? Both statements could be true, the detective liked to say. Competence and ignorance have been married a long time. In quieter rooms, the museum wrestled with its own kind of blame. It is always too easy, after a disaster, to backdate omniscience. The security plan that had seemed reasonable the week before now looked thin. Everywhere a blade had passed. A consultant spoke in sentences with no sharp corners about layers and redundancies, and how the job of a museum at night is to assume the worst politely and prepare for it thoroughly. The director nodded and took notes and stared out the window toward the courtyard where the light kept time. There were faces, of course, sketches made from posture and cadence composites, built from two guards' memory and a detective's hope. They went to air because that is what sketches do. The tip line took on a new flavor. Cousins who looked like the drawing X's, who stood like the taller one co-workers, who had once borrowed a jacket that made them look like a uniform. The detectives wrote it all down because that's the job. They also allowed themselves late at night the private calculation. Every investigator knows how many hours to spend on a maybe before it becomes a no. A week and a small breakthrough arrived dressed as a footnote. A technician comparing night logs noticed a pattern in the way a door close registered when it wasn't fully latched. He ran that waveform against the tape from the night of the heist and found the same hiccup in the same door twice, once at entry, once at exit. It didn't point to a person, but it pointed to a habit. Someone knew the temperament of that mechanism. Not a smoking gun, not even smoke, but the kind of warmth you put your hands near when the rest of the room is cold. As the reward grew, the bolder calls began. A voice from far away claimed he could arrange proof-of-life photographs, corners of canvases beside today's newspaper, as if paintings were hostages. Another voice said the works had already been traded 3 times and were now held as insurance against a different crime's worst outcome. The detective wrote insurance and drew a line to a box labeled leverage, then underlined it twice because patterns matter even when they lead to closed doors. The museum reopened with the frames still on the walls. Visitors came and did the thing human beings do. When confronted with absence, they filled it. With anger, with theories, with a hush that read like respect. A child asked where the pictures went, and a guard said carefully, "We hope they're coming back." In the Dutch room, a sign explained what hung there and what no longer did. And in that gap between history and present tense, the city felt itself learning a new grammar. The first theories did not solve the case. They rarely do. But they set the boundaries of the map everyone would carry forward, inside knowledge or practiced hands or both. Opportunists with uniforms that rang true, or professionals using a costume that the night would accept without question. Collateral, in a world where collateral can be traded in whispers, or trophies, in a world where trophies live in rooms with no windows. The detectives didn't have to decide yet. They had to keep moving, because motion is how you keep a case from going cold. On the corkboard, beneath the sketches, and the timelines, and the arrows that tried to force coincidence into cause, someone taped a photo from the gallery, a frame, empty and glowing. Under it, in handwriting that had the patience of an accountant, 3 words absence is evidence. It wasn't poetry, it was instruction. Read the cuts, read the root, read what they didn't take, then read it again. Tomorrow would bring names. Names always come the kind you can print, and the kind you have to file in a drawer, under words like confidential and sealed. Tomorrow would bring a lead that looked good enough to place a call to a city 2 states over, and a storage unit key that would open on nothing but dust and a rumor with enough specifics to make a prosecutor pace. But tonight, as the museum locked its real doors and guarded the holes where pictures should have been, the first theories sat side by side like suspects in a lineup. None of them looked quite right. All of them looked a little too right. And in the space between those two truths, the case began to live the life that would make it a legend. Names in the air. Names arrive before answers. They travel on the breath of a city, sticking to coffee lids and payphones, showing up in folded notes on a detective's desk, and in whispers traded over pool tables where the chalk dust is older than the stories. By the end of the first week, Boston had produced enough names to wallpaper a squad room. Some were the usual suspects, men whose resumes already carried every crime that didn't have a claimant. Others were newcomers, ghosts conjured by the particular theater of 2 uniforms at a door, and the quiet confidence that moved through galleries like a practice parade. The job now was to separate names, meant to help from names, meant to distract, and to do it fast enough that the case didn't solidify into myth. The lead detective started a ritual he would keep for months. At dawn, he'd walk the path the thieves had likely taken inside the museum, then sit in the Dutch room while the courtyard light climbed. He'd look at the empty frames until absence began to behave like presence. You learn things from what isn't there, he liked to say. The Vermeer's void pulled at him hardest, not only because of value, but because of appetite. To want that picture, to risk it, to cut it, whether from ignorance or audacity, told him something about the mind that had stood where he was standing now. Back at headquarters, the day began with triage. Overnight tips were sorted into piles specific, plausible, performative, delusional. Every pile had to be touched. A caller described a storage unit with a chemical smell and a private lock. Another insisted he'd seen rolled canvases in a friend's basement, then couldn't remember which friend. A woman from 2 states away said her ex had bragged about a job involving uniforms and an old lady museum, then refused to say his name until the reward doubled. The detective assigned to the line had a voice made for calm weather. He used it on every storm. Then there were the brokers, or people who sounded like they wanted to be. They didn't say ransom. They said terms. They said conditions. They asked for letters that promised possession wouldn't equal prosecution, the kind of document a museum cannot write, and a prosecutor will not. They dangled proof that could be staged, and withheld proof that could be useful, like cigarettes poised above a flame. You don't hang up on a voice like that. You widen the call. A federal agent joined the line from a room with a blank wall and a quiet clock. A museum lawyer sat with a yellow pad and wrote phrases the way a surgeon draws incisions, clean, minimal, survivable. One caller asked to fax a corner, literally a corner of canvas cut neat, photographed beside that day's newspaper. It came through as gray sludge. The date was right. The fiber could have been anything. A conservator took one look and shook her head. The detective thanked the sender anyway. Sometimes courtesy keeps a door ajar that slamming would shut forever. On the street, names grew legs. A longshoreman with a memory like an index card box said he'd heard of a van that went inland at dawn. Inland became a town. The town became a warehouse with an owner who kept cash and silence in the same drawer. The team drove out in two cars that looked like they belonged to other jobs, showed badges, gently asked questions that sounded like favors. The warehouse held forklifts and dust and the smell of oil. Nothing that paints can cling to. They logged the visit anyway. Absence is evidence. Inside the museum, the staff learned how to talk in public about private pain. A guide developed a sentence that worked on school groups. The frames you see are a promise. We leave them up to say we're still looking. The director learned to breathe before she said, "We will recover them," so the sentence wouldn't sound like prayer alone. A guard, the kind who knows every footfall in the building by its echo, found himself pausing at the Dutch room threshold as if asking permission to enter a sick room. The detectives, meanwhile, drafted a list of practical questions that had nothing to do with art history. Which pawn shops took in things that never touched the counter? Which shipping companies tolerated crates with irregular paperwork? Which storage facilities had back gates you could lift by hand if you knew where to press? Which thieves liked costumes, and which thieves preferred keys? The city answered in pieces. A beat cop remembered a burglary crew that dressed for the job. A parole officer mentioned a guy who used a scanner like a musician uses a metronome. A public defender rolled her eyes at a familiar name and said he couldn't plan his way out of a paper bag, then added grudgingly that he did have a cousin who could. Names grew heavier when they intersected with time and place. A man who couldn't possibly have been there suddenly could when someone found a traffic citation with his signature an hour earlier and a mile away. Another who looked perfect on paper went light as air when a hospital chart proved he was under a surgeon's knife. The night the bell rang, the whiteboard in the bullpen became a weather map of certainty and doubt, arrows dates, asterisks, a circle around a name, a line striking it out, a new circle 3 inches away. Cases like this aren't solved by epiphanies. They're solved by erosion, everything that isn't true wearing away, until what's left can hold weight. A week in the first, this could be it led, arrived wearing a smell of truth. A caller used the right jargon without overplaying it, described a rolled canvas in a tube with the wrong kind of caps, mentioned a cut edge that left canvas hairs invisible unless you knew where to look. He wanted to talk outside. The meet was set in a lot behind a strip mall at an hour that makes even honest cars look guilty. The detective went with an agent who had a good ear for panic. The man who showed was nervous, but not theatrical. He said he could arrange a look. He wouldn't say where. He wanted the letter the one defense attorneys dream up and prosecutors refuse on reflex. The negotiation became a dance. Steps forward, steps back, a hand that hovered, then withdrew. In the end, the man left with less than he wanted and more than he deserved, a phone number that would pick up when he called again, and a promise to listen. Later, when the number never rang, the detective imagined the possibilities: a test by someone who measures patience, a test by someone measuring headlines, a man who told a story loudly enough that the story told him right back. Theories thickened. Organized crews were mapped. Known burglars were interviewed and denied with complicated sincerity. An inmate's rumor traveled through three mouths and arrived misshapen, but interesting a painting in a climate-controlled room behind an office that sold something else. Agents followed the rumor through three jurisdictions, asked three sheriffs for a little quiet cooperation, and opened the door on a neat room full of the wrong kind of rectangles. Luxury appliances. Not a brushstroke in sight. They laughed, then didn't. Meanwhile, an art crimes specialist briefed the team on the afterlife of stolen work. It doesn't hang in a villain's dining room, he said. It lives in the dark. It acquires a value that has nothing to do with auction houses and everything to do with bargaining a sentence reduced. If the right painting resurfaces, a charge declined. If the gallery wall becomes a chip, you can cash. He wrote the word leverage on a legal pad and circled it. The lead detective smiled without humor. He had written the same word on day one and underlined it twice. Another letter. This one included a real detail, the exact width of a frame's rebate, the lip where canvas sits. It also included a demand that made the lawyers close their eyes, immunity so broad it could shelter a storm. The museum declined the impossible and accepted the inevitable. The conversation would go on without a conclusion until someone wanted something more than money or mercy. In the meantime, the frames watched the door. Names kept coming. Some stayed long enough to deserve surveillance. A man whose swagger came with a story about uniforms turned out to be recycling a legend older than the museum itself. Another, who had never once been early for anything, showed up on time for a meeting with detectives and talked about freight pallets and night schedules and how easy it is to look like you belong if you carry a clipboard and walk as if you're due somewhere. He didn't fit the right hour. He fit the right idea. The detectives kept his number. In the Dutch room, the morning light turned gold into a gentle fire. The lead detective stood under the Vermeer's absence and tried to feel the weight of a choice made in a different weather. He imagined a blade, a breath, a decision to abandon the third floor because the clock was winning. He imagined a car on a silent street and the way the city looks when you've done something that cannot be undone. He imagined only briefly what it would be like to lift the phone and hear a voice say the sentence every case officer rehearses and almost never receives, "I can bring you to them." He walked back to the bullpen and found new names on the board. He drew lines through two circled. One added an arrow from a warehouse to a man to a door that hadn't latched fully the way a tape suggested it might have. He pulled a file he'd read already and read it again because repetition is a form of prayer in work like this. And then he did the thing he always did before the next wave of tips rolled in. He sat. He breathed. He looked at the map and let the noise settle until a smaller, truer sound survived. Names in the air are weather. You don't curse weather. You read it. You listen for the change in pressure. You notice when the harbor goes quiet and the gutters fill and the wind shifts. Then you go where the storm suggests, and you carry a coat you don't mind ruining, and you hope the next door you open doesn't look back at you with the same blind innocence as the first. Tomorrow, a name would rise above the others just enough to pull a car 2 hours north onto a road lined with pines toward a building set back from the highway, with a lock that could be slit in a minute and a light that never worked. The detective would stand in the doorway and feel the cold and think not for the first time about the difference between a lead and a legend. And then he would step inside, a door in the pines, 2 hours north. The highway narrows, and the map stops pretending it knows every turn. Pines crowd the verge. Snow stays in the ditches long after the city has shrugged it off. The building sits back from the road exactly the way the tipster set a low rectangle with a corrugated skin, one sodium light, dead over a roll-up door that lists a little to the left. If you were the kind of driver who kept your eyes on the center line, you'd never see it. If you were the kind of thief who planned routes by sightlines, you'd see nothing else. The detective parks far enough away that gravel won't announce him. An agent he trusts for her patience meets him at the shoulder, and together they become the ritual. Every search needs knock, wait, knock again. Present the paper. Use the voice that says, "We can do this gently or loudly, and either way, we're going to do it." The lock yields with a cough. Cold air breathes out. Inside, the smell is oil and dust, and something else, faint and indecisive, cardboard old tape, the memory of varnish. The agent lifts her flashlight. Beams rake the dark. Crates. Pallets. A forklift that probably dreams of warmer warehouses. Rows of boxes labeled with a confidence that feels like Bluff Parts Tools archive. The detective knows better than to expect drama. Real finds rarely look cinematic. The first crate holds coils of hose. The second fans still in their plastic. The third is empty, except for a length of twine and a shipping sleeve with a corner torn away and a stamp from a port that makes the agent and the detective exchange a look neither of them names. In the far corner, a cardboard tube lies under a tarp. The detective lifts it like something that could change a career. It doesn't. Blueprints. Building plans for a strip mall that never survived its second winter. He laughs once without humor and slides them back. Absence is evidence, he reminds himself. Though today, the evidence feels like a joke told for the 100th time. The owner arrives in a truck that sounds like it has loved and outlived 3 different jobs. He has the manner of men who do not ask questions because they expect not to be asked. He answers politely, which is not the same as helpfully. Tenants come and go. Cash keeps the lights on. He knows faces, not names. He remembers a renter who liked to work at night. Couldn't say when. Couldn't say how long. The detective notes the rhythm of the man's memory, generous where it cost nothing, inconveniently vague, where it might have purchased certainty. They leave the place cleaner than they found it. Habit, respect, superstition. The agent pockets the torn sleeve for the lab fiber, sheds glue blooms, trace pollen. You work what you have. Outside, wind runs a cold palm across the field. Pines keep their own counsel. On the drive back, the detective lets the road carry the noise out of him. Leads are weather. This one blew cold. Back in Boston, the tip line sings a different key. A voice that has called twice before and said nothing useful, either time asks for a meeting. Not cash first, not immunity first. Respect the voice says, which could mean anything, from don't print my name to I want out of something worse than this. They set it for a motel, astride the interstate, the kind of place that sells discretion by the week. The room smells like old cleaner and older smoke. The lamp works. The TV does not. The man who walks in wears a coat with a tired collar and a confidence that doesn't match his shoes. He wants to be called a broker. He says it like a title. He claims he can arrange proof of life, not for all of it. No one ever says all of it, but for a piece that matters. He won't say how he knows it matters. He offers a sequence that sounds rehearsed. A corner, photographed with today's paper. A watermark. The back of a stretcher bar with a mark. Only a conservator would spy, whispered to him by someone who owes him. He uses the kind of nouns that live in cases like these, my guy. The people. The room blurry words that become crisp only when you are the one who can open the door. The detective will not say immunity. The agent will not say money. They say the things investigations can say: consideration, discretion, the possibility of outcomes that do not ruin lives unnecessarily. The man wants more than they can offer, and less than he dares ask for. He leaves with a number that will answer after midnight and before dawn. He leaves with a sentence the detective will hear in his sleep. You're not the only ones who want out of this clean. The number doesn't ring that night or the next. Deals in the dark obey the weather in men's heads. Most are canceled by fear before they're canceled by law. Weeks stack. The museum reopens. The frames stay up. The director stands in the Dutch room before visiting hours and decides that the decision leave emptiness where art used to be is an act of honesty, not theatrics. Children ask the right question with the wrong verb. Where did they go? A guard answers with faith. We think they're coming back. Faith is a tool too, like a blade, like a badge. A false dawn arrives, the way false dawns like to in a rush with a chorus. A caller offers not talk, but a place. Not the art, not even a piece of it, but packaging that has touched it. A storage locker near a commuter rail spur, paid in cash and visited at odd hours. The unit opens like an apology, stale air. A furniture blanket, 2 tubes, 3 flattened boxes, with the names of manufacturers who sell nothing a museum would display. The tubes hold posters, a Degas dancer, with the color wrong, a Rembrandt print, with a reproductions give to it. The boxes smell like old glue and wheat paste. Someone has staged the room for the wrong show. Except, in the dust along the baseboard, a little ladder of staple scars in the wall. Odd spacing, not contractor work. The kind of pattern a hand makes when it rehung something twice and never quite found the same holes. The detective kneels and measures without speaking. He will take the wall if he has to. He will take the silence if he doesn't. A conservator visits the locker and runs her fingertips an inch above the wall without touching. She talks about rub lines and ghosting the marks heavy frames leave when they lean against paint for seasons at a time. She shakes her head. Not heavy enough, she says. The detective nods, grateful for the brutality of expertise. Better a hard no than a soft, maybe that eats a month. At headquarters, a federal art crime specialist drums his fingers on a file and gives the talk that feels like catechism now. Stolen art is currency, not decor. It travels poorly, but it travels. It sits in rooms without windows, picking up the smell of the last life it passed through fish cigarettes, damp wool. It appears when someone needs it to argue down years on a different charge. Leverage, he says, and circles the word. Though by now, the detective could write it on the inside of his eyelids and read it in the shower. From a prison 2 states away, a letter arrives with handwriting that mistakes drama for discretion. Its author claims proximity to a man who knows a man who saw the storm picture rolled in brown paper under a bed in a row house where the radiators hiss all winter. The letter includes a map drawn as if from memory with a street that exists and a house number that does not. The detective calls the warden, then calls the inmate's counselor, then calls the public defender, who sighs and says the man writes a lot of letters when parole season is a rumor. The map goes on the board anyway, with a thumbtack the color of hope. You have to let some fictions sit long enough to prove themselves. The broker calls back. The one from the motel. He suggests a meet at a bar that changes its name every few years but never changes its lights. The detective hates bars for business. The noise, the shadows, but goes because refusing to go closes doors you don't yet know you'll need. The broker arrives in a different coat with the same shoes. He orders a soda like a man who has promised himself something and is not sure he can keep it. He slides an envelope across the table with fingers that do not want to let go. Inside Polaroids, corners of something that could be a canvas, hairy with the rough fringe you only get when the cut hurried. A stretch of back that could belong to a frame with a pencil notation in a hand that looks old-fashioned even in black and white. A tape measure in one shot lays down inches that mean nothing until you set them against a catalog entry and discover they might mean everything. The detective does not let hope show. He asks for provenance. The broker smiles the way men smile when they think a secret makes them taller. The lab calls the next day with an answer no one can live on non-fibrous particulates that could have come from a century anywhere. A graphite that could be the right graphite or just graphite. A surface patina that says old not which old. The conservator stares at the Polaroids and murmurs a name under her breath, the way a person says the name of a friend they haven't seen in too long. If it's staged, she says finally, it's staged by someone who has been near the real thing. The sentence is both invitation and warning. Negotiations become choreography. The broker wants assurances. The detective offers consideration. The agent sets terms like stepping stones over a river that runs fast, location first, no cash, visual confirmation in person, no custody without counsel. The broker parries with a laugh that tries to sound easy and comes out brittle. He proposes a neutral site. He says, we won't come alone, and neither will you. He hangs up with a flourish that pretends endings are choices. Winter thins. Phone logs thicken. The museum walks a line between transparency and the kind of quiet that protects the chance of success, however theoretical. The director stands at a podium and says, what can be said, the reward stands. The investigation is active. We believe recovery is possible. Behind her, the frames perform their new function, which is to remind everyone that belief without work is just weather. The detective returns to the Dutch room when the building empties. Evening finds the gold deeper. Shadows sit where pictures used to. He tries to think like both sides at once, the thief who cut because it was faster, the broker who parlays because it is safer. He imagines a storage room that has not yet known light, a space under stairs, a false wall in a house where no one asks why the closet is smaller than the room demands. He imagines a conversation that begins with a sentence the broker cannot quite bring himself to say, yet I can take you close. When he steps back into the corridor, a child's voice drifts in from the courtyard, high, sincere, unafraid. Why don't they just give them back? A parent answers in the way adults answer, when the truth is a tangle. Sometimes people keep things because they think it will save them from something worse. The detective, who has chased that sentence through 100 rooms, nods once to an empty frame like a promise. Tomorrow will bring a meet that almost happens, and a car that waits with its engine off by a river that remembers everything, and a shadow of a figure who checks a watch and doesn't show. It will bring another letter with a demand no one can honor and a detail no one can ignore. It will bring threaded through the city's noise a new name that touches two old ones in a way the whiteboard hasn't offered yet. The case will lean, not fall, not yet, but lean, which is how movement starts when you're pushing a weight that does not want to be moved. The meet that didn't happen. They chose a place that pretended not to notice anyone, a riverside pull-off where truckers nap between runs, and fishermen pretend the city is farther away than it is. The rules were simple, because simple is survivable. No uniforms, no wires that would make a nervous man see ghosts. Just a car with the engine off and two people who could listen without blinking every third sentence. The broker arrived as a silhouette that kept its distance. He checked his watch, the way men check their courage. Then, without closing the space between, he lifted a phone, turned the screen toward the dark, as if that could count as proof, and let a single sentence hang in the cold. They want more. He turned, walked back to a second car that had been idling with its lights off, and left the way. Fear leaves a deal fast without goodbye, before either side can decide what they might have risked together. The detective and the agent waited 10 minutes for prudence, 5 for pride, 2 for the hope that gets people killed in other stories. Then they drove across the bridge and let the river keep its secrets. In the rear view, the city lights looked like a lie. The night tells itself, everything's fine. Everyone's asleep. No one takes the past and rolls it into the size of a man's arm. Back at headquarters, the whiteboard had grown a new peninsula of arrows that didn't touch the mainland. The broker's line, meet, proof, location, now had a red X over proof. More could mean anything. Money immunity, a letter phrased so gently it would go limp in court. The museum's counsel, who had learned to fold her feelings into sentences that didn't leak, wrote 4 versions of a promise and shredded 3. The one she saved was not a promise at all. It was a willingness to hear. In cases like this, you sometimes have to spend a week negotiating verbs. An hour after dawn, a letter arrived that sounded like a cousin to ransom, but refused to admit it. It demanded what couldn't be given and dangled what couldn't be ignored. There was a detail wedged inside it like a splinter, a pencil notation, 2 numbers, and a slash that matched the back-of-frame code in a conservation log from the 1970s, a mark that never made it to any press release or press conference. Either the writer had done homework so precise it bordered on art, or he had seen the wood. The conservator checked the log and didn't speak for a long time. When she did, it was a sentence that doubled as a needle on a compass. Whoever wrote this has been closer than we've been in 30 years. Names reassembled themselves around that scrap of specificity. The detective drew a triangle that connected the broker, the letter, and the torn port sleeve from the corrugated warehouse 2 hours north. He wrote the port code under the splintered detail and drew a line to a shipping forwarder that had once operated in a pier district now disguised as condos and coffee. That forwarder's clerk, arrested on a different charge the year before, the heist had a brother whose phone pinged off a tower near last night's meet. The board didn't look solved. It looked less arbitrary. At the museum, the director kept her morning ritual. She stood in the Dutch room before the doors opened and let the frames explain themselves again. This is what it looks like when history leaves and refuses to leave. A school group that hadn't read the news filed in with the energy of kids learning to whisper. A chaperone asked a guard, "Do you think they're safe?" The guard answered honestly in a way that chose its words, like stepping stones. I think there's somewhere that isn't the wall, and I think someone wants something from them. The chaperone nodded the way adults nod when they've just heard the truth and wish it were kinder. The port angle gave the team homework that felt like archaeology: old manifests, side ledgers, a storage lot on the edge of a tide line where salt eats numbers off signs. The forwarder had changed names 3 times, shed one corporate skin after another, like a snake getting rid of what it couldn't grow past. The clerk's brother ran a side hustle renting space in a cinder block warren that smelled like engine coolant and bleach. The agent knocked with knuckles that had learned to be patient. The brother answered with a grin that said, "I've never met a federal badge before." It also said, "I've met too many." He offered keys with the speed of a man who knows it's better to be generous with doors than stingy. The rooms gave back what rooms give back when you're late by decades: the outline of pallets long gone, the dark ghost of a rectangle on a wall where something once leaned, boot prints preserved in dust like accidental signatures. In one unit, a box of glassine sheets lay under a tarp, clean crisp, the kind you wrap drawings in when you plan to move them but never do. The conservator ran a finger over the sheet's edges and found only the faint burr of manufacture. Newer than they should have been. Older than any hope attached to them. Someone wanted to look like they knew what they were doing, she said. The detective wrote not without affection, performative professionalism. The broker resurfaced at the end of a day the case would have otherwise wasted. A payphone, because some people still believe an old habit is bulletproof. He spoke quickly. He said he had a corner, and this time he didn't mean a photo. He named a church parking lot 2 neighborhoods away and a time that was too bright for comfort. The agent vetoed the lot on principle. The detective vetoed it on instinct. They countered with a diner that had the right kind of glass-wide public reflective. The broker countered with silence. Then you'll know it when you see it, like a magician with a tired deck. They went to the diner and ordered coffee, because you can't interrogate air with empty hands. The broker didn't come in. He sat in a car across the street and stared at his steering wheel as if it could answer him. After 10 minutes, a teenager in a green jacket cut across the sidewalk and dropped a padded mailer into the trash can by the door, the way kids are paid to drop nothing into nowhere. The agent walked outside, slow enough not to spook anyone, and fast enough to steal the moment. The mailer gave like a pillow. Inside, a triangular slice of canvas that looked wrong and right at the same time: wrong because it should not have existed. Right because at its cut edge, the weave resolved into a geometry the lab would later call consistent, not conclusive. There was graphite on the back, but graphite is a liar. There was age in the ground, but age can be borrowed. There was a faint bloom of dust that cataloged an old room, but rooms talk in dialects a microscope can't always parse. The conservator's face went careful the way faces do when they've decided to feel nothing until the facts insist. If it's staged, she said, someone has learned our language. If it isn't, someone is running out of patience. The detective wanted to underline the second sentence. He didn't. He paged the broker's number and received the only reply men send when they've pulled a pin they can't push back in nothing. The museum's board wanted to know if progress had a definition they could hear. The detective explained how progress in a case like this is measured in the clarity of maybes. You shrink the field until the wrong people get bored and the right people get nervous. He pointed to the triangle that had formed on the boardport broker letter and tapped the splinter detail like a metronome. Whoever wrote that has touched wood, he said. No one needed him to finish the thought. Wood does not stay patient forever. Outside the investigation, the story had acquired religion. Not faith the museum had in manageable portions, but ritual. Bar talk found a style. People spoke about the Vermeer as if it were a person who had left the city for a long trip and sent only postcards with illegible signatures. A neighborhood rumor insisted one of the pieces hung in a back room of a restaurant where the owner showed it to no one on nights when the kitchen ran hot. A retired cop swore an informant's grandson had once described a closet with a false back. The detective wrote it all down because writing is how you make room for what will matter later. A small thing moved the needle more than any of those sermons. The torn shipping sleeve from the warehouse up north carried a smear of adhesive that wasn't standard. The lab matched it to a brand used by a single packing crew that had rented space under the forwarder's roof for 6 months in 1989-90. That crew's front man, a framer by trade and a problem solver by personality, had a nephew who once worked nights as a security subcontractor for institutions that liked to pretend they didn't need security. The nephew's name, when added to the board, touched the broker's area code and a storage unit that had been emptied 2 weeks before the first search warrants were signed. Lean not fall, the detective had said, which is another way of saying gravity has begun to whisper. They found the nephew at a garage in a town the highway mostly forgets. He met the badges with a shrug that wanted to be innocence and a grin that wanted to be disrespect. He said he didn't know anything about art, which might have been true in the same way a man can say he doesn't know anything about the ocean because he's only ever handled rope. He knew locks. He knew routines. He knew how uniforms fit men who were not cops. He didn't know why his uncle liked the old frames with the fancy lips, only that people paid better when the corners didn't crack. He laughed and then apologized for laughing. Guilt and gall often share a jawline. They went through his story, the way surgeons go through layers. Night contracts in buildings where the cameras didn't cover everything because nothing covers everything. A friend of a friend who kept a clip-on badge that would fool the kind of eyes that want to be fooled. A job where the door had to be persuaded. A loading dock that liked to listen to whoever spoke to it like an old friend. No confession, no miracle. But when the nephew said, a door can be convinced not to latch if you talk to it. Nice meaning. If you know exactly how much to lift and how far to pull, and which corner has a stubbornness older than the maintenance schedule, the detective wrote one word in the margin where only he would see it, waveform. The broker called again finally, in the voice of a man who had argued with people who didn't think he was necessary. He said he could get them near the room. Not in. Near. He demanded a letter no lawyer could sign, and a kind of amnesty no court could honor. The agent said no in a tone that made the no sound like a yes, if the world were kinder. The detective offered what the law allows discretion at the margins, an open door to talk before other doors close. The broker tried to bargain with adjectives sooner, cleaner, safer. The detective bargained with nouns, time, place, proof. They settled on a geometry 1 step for 1 step. The broker would name a building. The team would bring a conservator to look, not touch. No arrests at the curb unless the law reached out on its own. The name he gave was the kind of place you'd never put on a postcard a storage building behind a strip of offices that used to sell insurance and now sell nothing but light. The unit had changed hands twice in the last year, the way things do when panic looks for a different mailbox. The roll-up door had a dent in the shape careless forklifts leave. Inside, shelving. Boxes, a smell the lab tech would later call consistent with lacquer and smoke. And on the far wall, faint almost shy, a rectangle of cleaner paint, where something had rested long enough to leave a lighter memory of itself. The conservator stood in front of the ghost and talked to the wall like an old colleague. "You rolled something away?" she said softly, as if the paint could answer. "And you leaned something here that wanted to breathe." She pointed to two scuffs at knee height. "Frame feet," she murmured, then louder to the room. "Not heavy enough for a big one, but old and fussy." The agent hovered at the door, because doors have feelings about nights like this. The detective looked at the shelf and the floor and the places where dust doesn't settle if hands have been busy. He looked at the line the case had drawn from a bell at 1:24 a.m. to a frame that still glows around nothing, to a warehouse that smells like varnish and cigarettes. He could feel the lean become a shift, small, real, survivable. Not falling. Not yet. But ready to. Tomorrow, we'll try to knock the case off its new balance. A call will say the canvases are already out of state. A letter will insist they never left the city. A rumor will swear they went out to sea under a manifest that declared them furniture. Somewhere, a man who has touched wood will decide whether to touch a phone. Somewhere else, a door will learn whether it wants to latch tonight. And in the Dutch room, the frames will keep their vigil gold burning around emptiness like a halo that refuses to dim. Near the room, the building the broker named had the kind of address that hides in plain sight a number no one memorizes on a street that belongs to errands, not secrets. Midweek, mid-afternoon, the lot looked like every other lot in the city that had outlived its first purpose. Glass doors with tenant names in vinyl that curled at the edges. A dentist who worked short days. A tax office that breathed hard in spring and slept the rest of the year. Around back, the storage row squatted like a sentence no one wanted to finish. The detective stood with the agent under a winter sun that had lost interest in warmth and felt the small tilt in his chest that comes when a map and a week of bad leads finally rhyme. The broker arrived in a car with plates borrowed from a better story. He parked 3 spaces away, measured the distance like he was pricing it, then slid out without the envelope, the swagger, or the earlier theater. He looked smaller in daylight, like a man who had said too much in the dark and was now trying to speak around it. "I can get you near the room," he said, as if repeating the phrase could bless it. Near had rules. No names, no questions, no recording devices, unless you wanted the near to turn into never. The agent let silence do the work grown-ups pay for. The broker took a breath and led them around the corner to a service corridor that smelled like mop water and dust. The door he pointed to wore its indifference honestly beige paint, a lock with a bite pattern that said the keys had been copied in too many different hardware stores. The broker didn't have a key. That was part of the pitch. He could put them in the neighborhood. The rest was their job. The agent listened to the lock with a pick the way a violinist listens for a note. The cylinder surrendered exactly the way cylinders do when they have tolerated amateurs and will now accept a professional. Inside a short hall, a bank of 2 more doors, a bulb that hummed, and air that carried the kind of smell conservators describe with the same precision meteorologists use on wind. Old wood, dry cloth, a memory of solvent you can't buy over the counter. They did not rush. They didn't have to. The agent ran an index card along the jamb and collected dust that clung the way dust clings when it has been allowed to settle for months, not years. The detective traced his gloved finger over the floor and found the faint scuff of something heavy that had been set down gently and then lifted again, the way people with experience handle a weight that matters more than the muscles moving it. The first door yielded to a key that lived in the agent's pocket and a push that was more courtesy than force. Office. 2 metal desks. A calendar stuck 2 months behind. A corkboard with thumbtacks and no notes, like a rehearsal for a plan that never got written. The second door was the room the broker meant. The air inside was a degree cooler and a decade older. Shelving on 3 sides, the cheap kind that buckles under honest work and survives dishonest work just fine. On the back wall, the ghost of a rectangle in a cleaner field of paint, like the unit they'd seen 2 nights earlier, but larger, prouder, with the persistence of something that had leaned there long enough to teach the wall its shape. At the baseboard, 2 bruises where finials would have rested if someone had set a frame down like a tired person kneeling. The conservator, who had promised herself she would not say anything she couldn't defend in a lab, let one word out anyway. Old. They found nothing you can take into court and lay on a table like an argument that makes its own case. No canvas, no stretcher, no brass tag with a name spelled the way the museum spells it when it's feeling formal. But in the corner, under a box of forms that pretended to be boring, a length of cotton tie tape lay curled on itself the way tie tape does when it has been cut, not untied. It had dirt in its weave where fingers had worked it. It had a crease that matched the width of a stretcher bar and the stubbornness of someone who knows how to secure a rectangle to a rectangle without breaking either. The agent bagged it. The broker watched, like a man who wants to be thanked and forgiven in the same breath. The detective asked the question that sounded like a kindness and was really a test. Is this where they were? The broker stared at the wall, not at the men in the room, and shook his head. Where they stopped, not where they slept. He said they like people, say we, when they aren't sure they still belong to a thing. He would not say how long the room had been used, or whether it still was, or what the shift in air meant when you opened the door before 9 and after 9. He would not say who had keys. He tugged at the hem of his coat instead and asked for the letter again, the one that would make him safe from promises his friends had made other men long ago. The agent said what the law allows. The broker swallowed a disappointment he hadn't earned. When they stepped back into the corridor, the day had moved 1 notch toward evening. The light at the far end slanted the way light does when it finds something to confess. In that brightness, for the span of a breath, the detective let himself picture the thing you have to picture sometimes in order to keep working a rolled canvas that knows the curve of its own brushwork. A frame that still smells like hands. A crate that does not groan when lifted because the person who cut the wood measured twice. He closed the door on the daydream and went back to the work. The lab gave the tie tape a sentence, not a paragraph. Cotton that had known pressure. Dust that contained a city's worth of stories. Fibers that belonged to a world older than Amazon and newer than anything a museum would have wrapped with pride. Consistent, the report said, which in cases like this is a leash you can pull on without it breaking. The detective read it twice, because repetition sometimes persuades a stubborn mood to give you an inch. That night, the broker called with a voice that had been argued with. He said the room was burned, not on fire erased. The crew had spooked. The door they had opened that afternoon would look by morning like a broom closet that had never contained anything worth a second look. I told you they wouldn't like me bringing company, he said. The agent let silence do its work again, and this time the silence sounded like a ledger closing. The detective thought about the cotton tape and the wall and the bruised baseboard and decided the ledger still owed them. When the team returned, the paint was still wet. The shelving stood naked, relieved of its pretense. The air had been scrubbed by effort, not by time. The rectangle on the wall had been rolled over with a color almost, but not quite the same as its field. That almost told the truth, better than a perfect match would have. It was a lie made in a hurry. The agent smiled, the way people smile at an opponent who thinks speed will always beat patience. The conservator took one of those close-up photographs that put a decade inside a square inch and said, without triumph, fresh. The museum's counsel wanted to know whether near the room could be translated into near recovery. The detective explained again how the grammar of these crimes resists easy conjugation. Near is not soon. Near is not certain. Near is a direction, not a destination. It is a wind you can tack against and a weight you can lean into. It tells you which doors matter. It tells you which names have stopped entertaining themselves and started making mistakes. That last part he kept to himself. You don't say hope out loud in a room that has learned to live off nouns like patience and verbs like wait. The press learned through the mechanism cities build to leak on schedule that a space of interest had been identified. They said it the way weather people say system. Something might be happening somewhere. The numbers, with dollar signs, returned to headlines, and with them the sermon about priceless a word the museum preferred to avoid because it turned the art into a talisman instead of what it had always been. Work made by hands, rescued by hands, endangered by hands, and if the world cooperated, returned by hands. The director stood in the Dutch room and practiced a sentence that contained no promises and refused to surrender dignity. She said it 3 times and swallowed the 4th. The gold looked like it had learned to glow on its own. In the bullpen, the board on the wall shed 3 names and circled 2. The nephew who knew locks had left town with a suitcase that did not match his means. The framer by trade had paid a bill 2 years late with a wad of cash that smelled like smoke and mothballs. A shipping clerk's cousin had moved into a house with a closet that cut 6 inches out of a room where a closet had no business being. The agent arranged the names so that lines touched in ways they hadn't yesterday. The detective drew a box around the broker's number and tapped it with the blunt end of a pen. He's running out of adjectives, he said. Soon he's going to have to use a noun. The next meet was set without theater. No river, no diner. A parking structure that had not yet remembered it should be afraid of its own echoes. The terms were the same because the terms never really change. No cash, no arrest, unless the law insists, eyes only 1 step for 1 step. The broker sent a silhouette that moved like a man carrying a verdict. He stopped 10 paces away and said the sentence the detective had been training himself to hear without flinching. They want proof you're serious. He slid a small bundle across the concrete. Inside, a sliver of frame molding gilded with a leaf almost but not quite right. A splinter of wood with a cut at a pitch that matched a museum's habit and not a contractor's. A brass nail dark with age, and the kind of finger oils you can't fake without time. The conservator held the wood the way people hold a thing that could break them if they let it. She did not weep. She did not call it by a name. She said in the voice she used when she had to hand judgment back to the instruments, "If this is staged, the staging has read our archives. If it isn't, someone has begun to dismantle what they cannot sell and what they fear they can no longer keep." The detective felt the case move a fraction under his feet like a floor thinking about renovation. He breathed in the smell of old glue and thought without pleasure about deadlines that do not appear on calendars but live in men's nerves. The museum prepared for quiet, not for press. Quiet is the tool you use when volume would ruin the work. The director called a board member who had learned how to wring politics out of favors and asked for what could not be written down time with no questions. The agent briefed a prosecutor who knew how to leave a door open without inviting a parade. The detective memorized the corridor, where the lock would say yes, and taught himself again the shape of the room in his head, so that when the phone finally rang with a noun, he could move without asking his body to catch up. Night fell without consultation. The city did what cities do when they are about to believe something. It held its breath without admitting it. In the Dutch room, the frames kept shining with the stubbornness of objects that refused to be replaced by their own stories. A child in a red coat pointed at the emptiness and said, "That's where it goes," not went, and the guard nodded as if the grammar had been taught correctly at last. Tomorrow would not deliver a miracle. Miracles do not clock in. They appear and ask to be believed retroactively. Tomorrow would bring a call that chose a noun, and a time that disrespected sleep, and a place that pretended not to matter, an address with too many zeros a door, that had learned to be talked into, and out of service, a hallway that smelled like the past tense. It would bring men who had used adjectives for months and were finally ready to risk a verb. It would bring in a room that had learned to hold its breath, the sound absence makes when it decides whether to keep hiding. The noun. The call came at 3:11 a.m., an hour that makes even good news feel like a dare. The broker's voice was lower, as if he'd moved closer to the floor to keep the ceiling from hearing him. He didn't use adjectives. He used a noun. Room. He gave a street that never makes postcards and a building that rents itself by the month to businesses that avoid adjectives too. He did not say inside. He said under. The agent wrote the address on the back of her hand the way people do when a slip of paper feels too fragile for what a word might carry. The detective said the only sentence you can say to a noun at that hour, "We're coming," and they were already moving before the line went dead. The building had the civic optimism of the 1970s cinderblock honesty fluorescent hum paint that never quite learned how to be white. The night guard belonged to the tribe of men paid to say no until someone says yes more convincingly. The agent presented a document that had the weight of law and the tone of apology. Doors negotiated with keys. Keys negotiated with wrists. The elevator breathed them down, a floor passed where the directories stopped pretending to know. The broker had been careful with his prepositions. Under meant a corridor that used to be a loading spine, now pretending to be plumbing access, now pretending to be nothing at all. The room knew it was being said out loud. You can tell by the way air sits when it has been expecting company. The lock wore a scar from a tool that had cared about speed more than subtlety, a fresh bite that would look older by morning if someone painted over it in a hurry. The agent listened, with a pick touched the cylinder as if asking a favor from a neighbor, and the door obliged with a sigh that sounded like a word giving up the rest of a sentence. Inside was a lesson in restraint. No stage dressing. No crates stamped with exotic ports. A rectangle, 10 paces by 12, the walls a shade newer than their history, the ceiling braced with a confidence that spoke fluent weight, shelving along two sides. On the third, a wall panel that wasn't a wall if you knew how to see cut lines feathered with dust, a spacing that cared about proportions, screws that had been tightened by a hand that trusted muscle memory more than torque charts. The detective put his palm flat to the panel and felt what carpenters feel, whether a thing is a door pretending not to be. The conservator crouched where the baseboard met the floor and found what she was looking for without having to say she was. Two soft bruises in the paint spaced like the feet of a frame that has been set gently down and asked to wait. Above them, the ghost of a rectangle in a field, a shade lighter, not fresh enough to be foolish, not old enough to be innocent. The conservator did not name it. She touched air an inch away from the ghost and whispered a date she would later pretend she hadn't said. On the shelf, nothing theatrical, which is to say, everything that mattered. A bundle of cotton tie tapes cut clean, not frayed. A roll of glassine with a bite taken out of it by teeth that had never belonged to a child. A brass nail bent in the lazy L that happens when a hand too sure of itself leverages a stubborn corner free. A length of bead molding with gilding that almost learned its lesson from a century and then gave up halfway. The agent bagged without comment, which is a kind of prayer. The detective eased the knot wall off its pretense. Behind it, the space was exactly as wide as the thing it had been built to hide. Compression in the dust told a small, precise story. Something had leaned here long enough to teach the floor its shape, then left recently enough that the floor hadn't forgotten. Two dolly tracks stitched across the concrete like lines on a map a person draws when they intend to get lost only until the river. The room smelled of dry cloth and breath held too long. They were late by hours, not weeks. That's a particular kind of pain. It means your nouns are right and your verbs are wrong. Room, yes. Moved, yes. Recovered, not yet. The broker didn't show. His number rang into the kind of silence that has other men in the room, or no men, and a decision that closes doors from the outside. The agent tried 3 soft touches pager payphone, a number that belonged to a deli 2 blocks away, where a back line had a reputation for discretion. Nothing. The detective pictured the look a room gets when a conversation about consequences outgrows courtesy. He filed the image in the drawer investigations label, prices paid by people who thought they were doing business. They worked the room the way you work a scene that has already been cleaned by a hand that knew why it was cleaning. Lifts from paint and floor. A hair trapped in a screw head that didn't belong to anyone who had walked in tonight. Fibers that clung like faithful dogs to the underside of a shelf no broom could reach. The lab would later write sentences that refused heroics, consistent with not inconsistent with cannot exclude. When the truth is, late science is careful with promises. Upstairs, Day hadn't learned what night had done yet. The city warmed its hands on paper cups and pretended Mondays were just days. The museum was still hours from unlocking, but the director was already in the Dutch room, practicing the discipline of looking at absence until it speaks. The gold did what gold does in low light It believed in itself. A guard rolled a cart of stanchions into position and adjusted ropes that keep respectful distances. If the ropes felt different, when they guarded nothing, no one said. The port angle, the forwarder with names that shed like skins, breathed again when the agent matched the bent nails alloy to a small run from a framer who peeled off that outfit 3 decades ago to do private work that didn't always ask where a thing had come from. That framer's ex had a storage unit. The unit had been opened last week and paid forward for 6 months in cash. The manager remembered a truck with a tailgate lift that rattled like a pocket full of screws. The detective drew lines on the board that connected noun to nail to names that had been written small and now earned bigger letters. They knocked the storage unit, not because miracles live there, they don't, but because false walls breed in families. Inside, a false back built with the same wrist as the room. This one sloppier, this one hurried. Behind it, a row of travel frames, 2 empty, one with canvas dust, like a memory, but no canvas. The travel frames were modern, professional, plausible deniability in a rectangle. One had a packing list tucked under the lip, coded like people code things when they believe codes make them invisible. 3 words in pencil, Storm Girl Night. The conservator stared at the handwriting until the words became nouns without meaning, then looked away so they could keep any meaning they had. The prosecutor asked, when briefed, whether they could move on anyone yet. The agent said what agents have to say when they can smell a case but cannot taste it, not if you like your charges to stand up after the paper leaves your desk. The museum's counsel asked whether the word recovery had a date attached to it. The detective evaded dates and talked about gravity instead. You don't pull stolen art back with rope. You bring the men around it to a place where keeping it costs more than giving it up. Then you stand where the price is payable and hope they arrive while the room still knows their names. The city, as if sensing a shift it hadn't been told about, started telling itself kinder lies. A bartender said a guy he trusted had heard the Vermeer was 2 neighborhoods over under linoleum. A cabbie swore a fare had described a basement that smelled like roses and turpentine. A retired dock worker said he'd seen a crate he didn't like the feel of the week after the heist, and no one asked him why he was only remembering now, because sometimes the mind releases a detail the way a hand releases a coin into a fountain. The detective wrote them down and didn't let hope use up oxygen he needed for work. That night, the broker called from a number that had never called anyone. His voice had edges now. He said there was no more room. He said the word burned again, meaning erased, not fire. He said they were talking about ocean, which is a noun that ends conversations or moves them to different tables with fewer chairs. He wanted the letter again. He wanted the word immunity to mean what television had taught him it could mean. The agent told him what the law could live with. The detective told him where the door would be when the price changed hands. The broker said they didn't think the door would be necessary. The line went quiet, as if someone else had put a palm over the mouthpiece. Then it died. The next morning, a rental contract coughed up the name of a moving company that existed for 3 months and never again. Its truck appeared on 2 traffic cameras at times that respected the window between the room and the unit with the false back. The plates traced to a dead company and a box in a storage locker now rented by a different name that belonged to no one you could arrest. The lab matched a smear of adhesive on the travel frame to the same off-label tape from the first warehouse up north. The board in the bullpen looked less like an argument and more like a story. Stories are easier to put in front of judges. They are still not art on walls. In the Dutch room, a child asked the guide whether the empty frames were there because the museum was saving the spots. The guide said yes and felt the rightness of it in her chest, where sentences live when they've earned their keep. In the control room, the detective watched the old tape again, the blink of a door alarm that chimed and calmed, and listened to a waveform that had started this mess from one angle and was now from another a lullaby. He rewound and played the sound at half speed until it stopped being an alarm and became a breath. You can talk a door into anything, the nephew had said. Maybe you could talk a room into giving something back. The team planned for quiet again, because quiet had done more work for them than noise. No pressers, no adjectives. They shaped a corridor of time between under and ocean and stood in it with patience, and patience is the tool that offends men who think momentum is a plan. The prosecutor drafted language that could receive nouns without poisoning them. The museum adjusted the reward in a way that made it visible without making it perform. The agent cut nights into slices and fed them to surveillance teams who knew how to wait without being seen. What came next wasn't triumph. Triumph has trumpets. What came was a resignation letter from a lock that had done too much work. A corridor camera that caught a dolly without a person. A man in a coat built for a different winter, glancing at his watch and finding no courage there. A door that learned a new word open, then close, then open for a different key. A broker who stopped answering because nouns had caught up to him. Evidence that climbed from consistent to likely to you could bet your job on it, just not this week. And still, no paintings on tables. No canvas rolled out under lights, while a conservator wept. The detective drove to the museum when the day had finished pretending to be day. He stood with his back to the frames so he could look out into the room the way a painting would if it could look. He tried the sentence, "Absence is evidence," in his head, and found it still useful, still cruel. Then he turned and faced the gold again, and this time he let himself imagine the verb the city had been starving for. Not was not went, not hid, returned. He didn't say it out loud. Saying verbs out loud can scare them. He walked the perimeter once the way a guard walks when the building is asleep, then put his hand lightly on the wall, where a rectangle glowed like a promise. The promise wasn't his to keep. It wasn't his to make. It was his to work toward, with nouns that knew their placeroom wall tape frame nail dust door. The rest would be a story the city could live with, or the silence that crimes like to keep for themselves. Tomorrow would be part 10, long after never quite over. Leads that age in barrels, and letters that spoil, and men who change phones the way other men change shirts. The frames would hold their vigil. The board in the bullpen would gain and lose names with the seasons. Somewhere, a room would learn a new noun, empty, and somewhere else, a hand would hover over a phone and decide whether the price was finally humanly right. Long after never over. Time didn't solve the case. It taught everyone how to live with it. Seasons turned. The city changed jackets. The museum learned a new cadence. Open the doors, greet the line watch people, walk to the Dutch room, the way you walk to a grave you've never visited but somehow recognize. Guides adjusted their sentences from present to past, and on good days, back to present again. The frames kept their vigil. Gilded, patient, stubborn. They were no longer props in a legend. They were artifacts of an event the way a shoreline is an artifact of a vanished tide. Visitors lowered their voices at the threshold without being told to, as if the emptiness itself set the rules. There were breaks that weren't, and tips that almost were. A crate in a warehouse that had the right smell and the wrong contents. A basement closet with a wall that measured suspiciously short and hid nothing but pipes. A broker who promised nouns and delivered adjectives, then disappeared into a silence that sounded like regret with a chaperone. A nephew who knew locks and learned courtrooms, pinched on a different job, entered into a record as a man who had brushed against a larger story and walked away unchanged, at least on paper. A framer who couldn't stop loving corners and finally found a charge that fit him, but not this one. Every few years, a rumor put a compass in someone's hand and sent the team to a doorway that felt promising, because doorways always feel promising. The detective wore the case the way old injuries announce rain. He rotated off back on up a rung, down a hall. His title changed more than his habit. He still went to the museum early on days that felt like weather. He would stand in the Dutch room before the first tour hands in his pockets and let the frames explain the difference between lost and missing. Lost is a verdict. Missing is a verb. The building with its plants and its hush and its stubborn gold refused verdicts. Policies learned the lesson art had given them the hard way. Museums wrote new scripts for nights and for doors. Guards were trained to be polite to uniforms and loyal to procedures. Cameras learned to love corners that once felt safe enough to ignore. Across the country, budgets argued with needs, and for once needs won a few fights. Security became a profession rather than a posture. Even so, anyone who has known theft knows this truth. You can make a thing hard to take, but you can't make it impossible. You can only make it not worth the price to the people who like to measure prices. The reward stayed on the books, rephrased, renewed, reannounced every so often, with a number that made headlines blink a figure with more zeros than adjectives. Rewards are invitations with a countdown no one can see. People called for money. People called for penance. People called because they had carried a story so long it had shaped them, and they wanted to set it down where it could stop working on their sleep. A few calls mattered. Most taught the team how to listen for breath that didn't belong to truth. The lab retired its first machines and bought new ones that could count a century in a speck. Fibers were read like diaries. Dust was asked what rooms it had loved. Graphite was made to tell whether it had kissed paper before the heist or after. Science became a kind of modest prophet, confident about what it could say, relentless about what it couldn't. Reports learned to love phrases like consistent, with likely cannot exclude the careful grammar of men and women who know how far a fact can walk without limping. The broker, if he lived, learned to prefer doors he could see through. The nephew learned, in the minor key of different cases, that a lock eventually remembers every hand that mocks it. The men whose names had once been written small on the bullpen board were crossed out, circled again, and finally filed in a drawer that said, "Not this way, maybe that way, maybe never." The file on the case grew heavy enough to be its own kind of furniture. New detectives inherited it and found in its pages a map of how to work a story that doesn't want to be worked. The city immortalized the heist without meaning to. Writers wrote, painters painted filmmakers, filmed podcasters spoke in 10 parts, and 1,000 thumbnails promised answers they did not possess. The frames appeared on posters as if they were themselves a kind of art, the art of waiting. The museum walked the line between invitation and exploitation, between telling the truth about loss and selling tickets to a wound. On good days, the truth won. On bad days, the wound did. There were anniversaries, 5 years, 10, 20, 30. Each one a chance to say still and yet and again. The director learned how to speak about hope as a posture, not a prediction. She said we believe not because evidence insisted, but because work deserved belief. She said we will keep the frames where they are because a promise has to be visible to survive. She stood in front of gold that glowed around nothing and looked for a second, like a person trying to remember the exact weight of a word she had said too many times. On a winter morning, without an anniversary attached to it, a letter arrived with the timbre of all the others, and a detail none had carried, before something so small a thief wouldn't bother to learn it, and so intimate only a conservator would remember having told it to a wall. It said the painting missed the light. It said the room made everything smell like old lemons. It asked for the same impossible document and offered the same impossible terms. The detective folded the letter along a crease he'd learned as a younger man and slid it into a sleeve labeled with the year. He went to the museum that afternoon and stood under the place where a storm at sea used to rage on wood. He breathed lemon into the air just once, just enough to remind himself that not every detail is performative. When the detective finally retired, he did what men do. When they climb down from work that has shaped the muscles in their face, he minimized. He told friends he would read more, maybe teach a seminar that let him turn the case into a syllabus and the city into footnotes. He told himself he would stop hearing the Dutch room at 5:00 a.m. He lied gracefully. On his first morning without a badge, he walked the river. The water made the same sound it had made the night the meet didn't happen. He bought a coffee from a window he'd never had time for and drank it as slowly as a man who had learned patience the hard way. Then he visited the museum and bought a ticket like everyone else. He stood among visitors who were too young to remember the first headlines and watched them learn the story through the architecture of the place. He listened to a child ask if the pictures were on vacation. He watched a parent negotiate the answer, then settle on the kind of honesty that makes adulthood bearable. They were taken. We're trying to bring them back. He smiled, then didn't. The case didn't end. Cases like this don't. They crystallize into something a city carries. Every few years, a name the board once circled returns like a migratory bird with different feathers. Every so often, a door opens onto a room that smells like old cloth, and you can see in the dust on the floor how something leaned against a wall and taught it to remember. Every now and then, a phone call uses a noun where an adjective used to live. The team that inherited the files knows the rhythm, now lean shift stall, lean again. They know that leverage is a currency with a half-life, and they know that men who borrow against it eventually have to decide between ocean and phone call. A few will choose the call. If there's a lesson, it isn't cinematic. It's procedural. It's patience sharpened into strategy. It's security that doesn't apologize for being inconvenient. It's the discipline of leaving the frames on the wall, because faith is not an internal emotion. It is an external architecture. It's the humility to admit that absence can, in fact, be evidence of the root of the appetite of the hand. And it's the understanding that a city can love what it's missing as fiercely as it loves what it has. At closing one evening, years later, a guard did what the detective used to do and walked the perimeter of the Dutch room alone. The building has noises that only people who love it hear: a beam adjusting to the day's temperature, a floorboard remembering every shoe, the palms in the courtyard comforting themselves with a whisper. He paused at the frame where the Vermeer had once hung and placed a hand flat on the wall, the way you lay a palm on a sleeping child's back. He imagined the room exhaling once, like a body deciding to wake. He didn't know, no one did, if a locker somewhere still held the curve of a canvas that knew how to hold light, if a false wall still leaned against a promise made by men who did not deserve to make promises, if a broker had found a verb he could live with. What he knew standing there, with the night settling into its corners, was that the building had learned how to carry absence without surrendering to it, that the gold would keep its glow until the day work quiet, unshowy, relentless found a way to put paint back inside it. That stories like tides return. When he turned to go, he caught his reflection in a window and mistook it for a heartbeat for someone stepping into the room. It wasn't a ghost. It was a person who had taken responsibility for a space that remembers. He smiled at the mistake and clicked the lights one by one, leaving the Dutch room last the way you leave the most faithful friend at the threshold of sleep. Outside the city were its usual evening buses, sighing tires on wet asphalt, the far gossip of sirens telling someone else's story tonight. In a storage building on a street with too many zeros in its address, a door thought about latching. In a house with an unnecessary closet, a wall learned to listen. In a drawer inside a squad room, a file settled into itself like a book that knows it will be opened again. And in a room where frames glow around air, people kept coming. They stood, they looked, they read plaques written in two tenses at once. They whispered without meaning to. They left with a new verb in their mouths, a quiet one they could carry home. Not solved, not finished, not even found. Just this still. And if the city is lucky, and the work is honest, and the doors learn a new word someday returned, when a city learns to live with an empty frame, it also learns to listen. Not just to rumors and anniversaries, but to the ordinary quiet that follows the loudest possible theft. In that quiet, security becomes culture. Caution becomes courtesy. And hope, real hope, shrinks to the size of a fingerprint on a brass nail, then grows again when a door decides to open. The Gardner heist never belonged to one room, or one night, or one pair of uniforms. It belongs to everyone who has stood before those gilded borders and felt the weight of a painting that isn't there. To the guards who still walk that last loop. To the techs who read dust like scripture. To the detectives who write nouns in the margins and wait for verbs that won't scare easy. If recovery comes, it won't sound like trumpets. It will sound like a phone placed gently on a table, a key turned once, a panel lifted off its pretense. There will be no perfect ending, only hands careful and practiced unrolling a century of light and air while a conservator whispers instructions to the past. The frames will not celebrate. They will simply do what they were made to do. They will hold, and if recovery does not come, the story still does its work. It cautions doors. It trains eyes. It reminds us that value isn't just a number you can headline. It's the labor of a life spent making something that survives you. Maybe that's why people still file into the Dutch room and lower their voices without being told to. The hush is not fear. It's respect. So we leave you where we began: a bell, a choice, a route through galleries that learned the shape of absence. Somewhere, a room is deciding between ocean and phone call. Somewhere a wall remembers how a frame leaned. And in Boston, every morning the frames glow around air, as if warming a place for what might one day come home. If this deep dive kept you watching, help us keep these stories alive. Hit like to push this case to more viewers. Drop your theory in the comments, be specific, be respectful, and tell us which clue you think mattered most. And if you want more long-form investigations, where evidence, patience, and people collide, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The frames are still empty, but the work isn't over.